Wyoming Territory, 1882. The wind kicked up dust along the tracks as the train hissed and groaned, preparing to leave the station in Rawlins. Cora Mee Mitchell stood stiff on the platform, her gloved fingers clenched around the worn leather strap of her carpetbag. Her cheeks were wet, and her vision blurred from the tears she had tried to hide. "Get back on that train, Miss Mitchell," the voice behind her said sharply, "and do not come back." Cora turned, her chest tight. Sheriff Dodd's face was hard, his eyes colder than the snow still clinging to the mountain peaks. Behind him stood Mrs. Fetter, head of the school board, arms folded like judgment wrapped in lace. "I came here to teach," Cora said, her voice cracking. "I only helped because the boy was sick." You gave medicine to an Indian child," Mrs. Fetter snapped. "You crossed a line." "He was dying," Cora whispered. "He was 5. Sheriff Dodd stepped forward. "You were warned. This town does not need troublemakers." Cora's throat burned. She looked past them, hoping for anyone to speak up. But no one did, not the shopkeepers, not the townsfolk she'd shared lessons with. No one. The train whistle blew. Cora turned slowly, her heart breaking, and stepped onto the train. She did not notice the man in the wide-brimmed hat watching from the edge of the freight yard, his jaw set, and his hands clenched at his sides. Victor Vaughn had seen enough of good people being pushed out by fear. He had been hauling cattle in from his ranch outside of Laramie when he caught sight of her stepping off the platform in tears. And when he heard what happened, something in him snapped. He had not spoken to Cora since that Sunday 3 months ago when she helped a Lakota boy in the schoolhouse and shared a quiet supper afterward with Victor under the cottonwoods. But he remembered her laugh. He remembered her kindness. And he remembered how she looked at him like he was not just another cowboy with dirt on his boots. He dropped the saddlebag from his shoulder and ran. The train began to move, wheels screeching against iron. Victor leapt onto the last car, caught the rail, and swung himself up. The wind hit him hard, but he pushed forward, moving between the cars until he found her. Cora sat near the back, her bag crumpled at her feet, her face turned toward the window, pale and silent. Her shoulders shook. He stepped into the aisle and said her name. She turned, eyes wide with disbelief and then confusion. "What are you doing?" she asked, voice raw. Victor knelt in front of her, not caring who watched. "You do not belong on this train," he said. "You belong by my side." Her lips parted, but she said nothing. "I have a cabin near Elk Valley," he said. "It is quiet, but it is good land. I need someone who can read the sky, love the land, and look a man in the eye. That is you, Cora." She swallowed hard, tears slipping free again. "I lost everything," she whispered. "They took my job. My place. Then let me give you something back," he said. "A home, a place where no one sends you away for doing what is right." The train picked up speed. Cora looked at the door, then at him. Her hand reached for her bag, trembling. "You mean it? I would not be here if I didn't." She stood, unsteady, and he steadied her with gentle hands. They moved through the swaying car and climbed down together at the next stop, just a water tower and a telegraph pole. The train shrieked away into the distance, but Cora did not look back. They walked to his horse, tied off behind a grove of cottonwoods. He helped her up, then swung into the saddle behind her, his arms firm around her waist. They rode for hours through golden light and quiet hills. The air smelled of pine and dust, the silence between them filled with something warm and strong. Victor's land was tucked in a small valley near Elk Creek. The house was weathered but sturdy, with smoke curling from the chimney and a dog barking in the yard. "There is a room upstairs," he said as they dismounted. "You can have it until you decide what you want." She looked up at him, her eyes still rimmed red but her voice steadier. "I want to help." "You already did," he said softly. "You helped a boy live." Now let me take care of you." Inside, the fire crackled. She took off her gloves and he handed her a blanket. That night, as the wind sighed outside, Cora sat in his kitchen with a bowl of stew and a mug of tea. He sat across from her, one hand wrapped around his cup, the other resting, fingers open, on the table. She reached out and laid her hand over his. Neither spoke. But something passed between them, quiet and sure, and neither of them pulled away. Morning came slow and colorless, the kind of gray light that pulled softly through the window panes before the sun dared show itself. Cora stood at the wash basin in the upstairs room, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands red from cold water. Her reflection in the cloudy mirror looked older than she remembered. Not by years, but by understanding. Downstairs, the clatter of kindling meant Victor was already up. She dried her hands on the towel hung by the stove and stepped softly to the stairs. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, the stone hearth still holding the warmth of last night's fire. Victor stood at the stove, back straight, one hand steadying a tin pan over the flame. He wore a clean shirt, sleeves rolled, collar open. His hair was still damp from the pump, and a streak of ash ran along his forearm. "I didn't mean to sleep so long," she said. "You didn't," he replied without turning. "Sun just hasn't caught up yet." She moved to the table, fingers brushing the edge of the chair before sitting. Outside, a jay called once, sharp and sudden. Victor set a plate in front of her. Fried cornmeal, a few slices of crisped bacon, and half an apple sliced neat. He took the seat across from her, not speaking for a long moment. "I'll ride out to the fence line today," he said finally. "Something's been nudging the wire near the creek." "Do you want help?" He studied her, eyes steady. "You ever strung fence?" "No, but I've patched a roof, shoveled coal, and stitched a mule's shoulder after it tangled with barbed wire." His mouth twitched, not a smile, but something close. "Then you might be better at this than me." She picked up her fork, the metal cool in her hand. "What kind of trouble do you get out here? Cougars in the hills, snow too soon or not soon enough, neighbors when they're drunk, and sometimes men with laws of their own." Cora looked up. "Do they come often?" "Not since I made it clear I don't answer to anyone not on horseback." She nodded once, then took a bite of the cornmeal. It was crisp at the edges, soft in the middle. She ate in silence for a while, the scrape of their forks the only sound. Victor leaned back, arms crossed. "You ever think about leaving the territory?" "I did," she said. "I thought I'd go back east, but I didn't like who I was there." "Why?" She wiped her mouth with the corner of her sleeve. "Because I was quiet. Because I let people tell me I wasn't enough." He nodded, slow. "I did the same once." "What changed?" "I watched a man beat his horse half to death and heard the town call it discipline. I left the next day." Cora looked out the window. The hills beyond the barn rolled soft, pale with frost. "How long have you had this land?" 6 years. "Bought it with what I had after the war. Built the house myself with help from a Cheyenne man and his brother. They traded labor for winter grain." She turned back to him. "You've never married?" "No." "Why?" He looked at her then, long and quiet. "Because no one ever looked me in the eye and made me want to stay." Her heart beat faster, but she didn't look away. "You think I'm going to?" He didn't smile. Instead, he rested his arms on the table, voice low. "I think you already did." The silence between them thickened, not heavy but full. Cora stood, took her plate to the basin, and began to wash it with the cloth hanging nearby. He rose too, setting his beside hers. "I'll saddle a second horse," he said. "If you still want to come." "I do." He held her gaze another moment, then nodded once and stepped out the back door. She watched him cross the yard, his boots crunching frost, his stride easy but deliberate. The dog followed at his heels, tail low, ears forward. Cora pressed her palm to the windowsill. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in months, She didn't feel like she was waiting for someone else to decide. She felt like she was already home. By mid-morning, the frost had melted into the dark soil and the sky stretched wide and pale blue above them. Cora rode beside Victor along a narrow path that wound through a stand of aspen, the horses stepping sure over fallen branches and damp leaves. She kept the reins loose, one hand resting easy on the saddle horn, the other brushing the edge of her coat where the wind tugged at the hem. Victor rode just ahead, his profile calm beneath the brim of his hat, gaze scanning the tree line with quiet precision. They hadn't spoken since saddling the horses, but the silence between them didn't press it settled. At the far edge of the pasture, they dismounted beside a stretch of fence that ran crooked along the creek. One of the posts had started to lean, and a length of wire hung slack, caught in the reeds. Victor knelt to examine it, fingers testing the tension. "Looks like a mule deer pushed through here. Might have been chased." Cora crouched beside him, brow furrowed. "Wolf, maybe, or a man with a rifle who doesn't care where he hunts." She reached for the coil of wire he'd tied to his saddle. "You trust the neighbors out this far, I trust a few. The rest I keep at a distance." He stood and took the post in both hands, driving it deeper into the earth with a steady rhythm. Cora held the wire taut while he anchored it, her palms stinging from the cold. They worked without words, falling into rhythm like they'd done it a dozen times. When the last staple was hammered in, he straightened and wiped his sleeve across his brow. "You pick things up quick." "I had to," she said. "My father died when I was 16. My mother didn't know a wrench from a spoon." Victor looked at her then, more fully. "What did he do?" Railroad foreman. "Lost his footing on a trestle near Ogden." He didn't offer sympathy. He simply nodded as though recognizing something in her that made sense now. They walked the fence line until the creek bent east and the hills began to climb. A hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp as glass. Victor watched it for a moment before speaking again. "There's a one-room schoolhouse just over that ridge. Been boarded up since last spring." Cora stopped walking. "What happened to it?" "Teacher married and moved to Colorado. No one's taken the post since. Families scattered too wide, most say it ain't worth the ride." She turned toward the ridge, squinting against the light. "What about you? Do you think it's worth the ride?" "I think the land needs more than cattle and fences to stay alive." They stood there a moment, the breeze lifting strands of her hair across her cheek. She didn't brush them away. "You think they'd let me teach there?" she asked. "If they don't, they'll answer to me." She smiled, small and dry, but it reached her eyes. "You always speak like that, only when I mean it." He turned back to the horses. Cora followed, her boots sinking into the soft earth. As she reached the saddle, she paused, one hand on the leather strap. "Victor?" He looked back. "Why did you follow me onto that train?" He considered her for a long moment before answering. "Because you were the first person I'd seen in years who didn't flinch when someone told her no." Cora mounted her horse without another word. But her chest felt warmer, as though something long buried had stirred. They returned to the cabin by dusk, the western sky streaked with rose and ash. Victor unsaddled the horses while Cora carried in the tools. The air smelled of pine smoke and coming snow. Inside, she lit the oil lamp and set a kettle on the stove. When he came in, she handed him a clean towel and nodded toward the basin. He muttered something about pine pitch on his hands and scrubbed them clean, shoulders loose with the weariness of honest work. She sat at the table, fingers curled around a chipped mug, and watched the fire slowly catch in the stove. He joined her, this time sitting close enough their knees brushed. She didn't move away. "This place," she said, voice quiet, "it feels like it's waiting for something." "It was," he said. "Now it's not." She looked over, eyes steady. "What changed? You did." The room held its breath, the only sound the soft tick of the kettle beginning to hum. She reached out, not sudden, not shy, just sure, and placed her hand over his. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He turned his palm and closed his fingers gently around hers. And for the first time in a long while, neither of them felt like they were standing alone. The first snow came 3 days later, soft and unhurried, settling over the hills like a hush. The pasture lay quiet beneath the pale veil, and the cattle moved slower, breath steaming in the cold. Inside the cabin, the warmth held steady. The stove fed with pine and alder until the iron glowed. Cora stood at the work table near the window, shaping biscuits with practiced hands. She had taken to rising early, not from habit but from want, the way the day stretched fuller when it began with purpose. Her hair was braided back, sleeves rolled, and the apron she wore was stitched from muslin she'd found folded in a trunk upstairs, still smelling faintly of cedar. Behind her, Victor sat with a ledger open across his knees. He held a pencil between his fingers, tapping it once against the page before making a mark. "Do you keep track of everything?" she asked, brushing flour from her knuckles. "Only what I don't want to forget." She set the biscuits on a tin sheet and turned. "What don't you want to forget? How much feed I've got left, how many calves made it through spring, what day the creek first froze." He looked up. "And that you said yes when I asked you to stay." She met his gaze. "I didn't say yes, not exactly." "You didn't say no." She laughed once, dry and low. "I suppose that's true enough." He closed the ledger and set it aside. "I've been thinking about the schoolhouse." She dusted her hands on the apron. "What kind of thinking?" "There's a family riding in from Medicine Bow next week. 4 children. They're hoping to settle near Willow Draw. If they do, that's 12 children within a day's ride." He paused. "Might be enough to open the doors again." She leaned back against the table, arms crossed lightly. "Who'd they ask to teach? They haven't yet. But they asked me who I'd trust with their children." She studied his face. "And what did you say?" "I told them the same thing I told you. That this land needs more than fences." The kettle began to rattle softly on the stove. Cora moved to lift it, pouring hot water into a tin basin to wash the mixing bowl. Victor stood and stepped beside her, reaching for a cloth to dry. "I never thought I'd end up in a place like this," she said. "Because of what happened in Rawlins. Because I spent my whole life believing I was only ever supposed to take up space quietly, that if I worked hard and didn't ask for more than I was given, I'd be safe." She paused, her voice steady. "Turns out safety isn't the same as belonging." He folded the cloth slowly. "You belong here. I'm beginning to believe that." They worked side by side until the kitchen was cleared. Outside, the wind shifted, sending a flurry of snow down from the roof. Victor stepped to the window, watching the flakes drift past the glass. "There's an old sleigh in the barn," he said. "It hasn't seen use in a few winters, but I could mend the runners." She joined him at the window. "You planning a ride?" "I was thinking of taking you into town, not Rawlins. Elk Hollow, there's a preacher there who knows me." Her breath caught, but she didn't turn from the window. "You planning to go alone?" "No," he said. "I was planning to ask you something." She looked at him then, the light catching in her eyes. "Then ask." He didn't kneel. He didn't reach for her hand. He only looked at her the way he had that night by the stove when the world had gone silent around them. "I want you to build a life with me here, not as a guest, not as someone passing through. As mine." The room held stillness, but not the kind that waits. The kind that listens. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she reached for his hand, not gently but firmly, fingers threading through his. "I'm not good at quiet smiles and soft words," she said, "but I'll fight beside you. I'll raise what needs raising. And I'll stay." Victor let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. "That's all I've ever wanted." She squeezed his hand once, then let go and stepped toward the door, pulling her shawl from the peg. Then let's go see that sleigh. If I'm going to marry you, I'd rather not arrive in a wagon full of feed. He grinned, wide enough to crease the corner of his eyes. Yes, ma'am. They stepped out into the snow together, boots sinking into powder, the barn just ahead and the hills beyond that open and waiting. The wind was cold, but they didn't feel it. They had work to do, and a life to begin. The sleigh made it down to Elk Hollow just after midday, pulled by a pair of chestnuts that Victor had trained himself. The road was narrow and rutted, packed with snow from early travelers, but the runners held true. Cora sat beside him beneath a thick wool blanket, her hands tucked into a muff lined with rabbit fur. She hadn't said much on the ride, but her gaze moved over the land with quiet recognition, as if naming it to herself one ridge, one bend in the creek at a time. Elk Hollow was little more than a trading post, a smithy, 2 saloons, and a clapboard chapel with a silver bell that rang once when they arrived. Victor guided the team to the hitching post beside the chapel and helped her down, his gloved hand lingering at the small of her back. She didn't draw away. They stepped inside together. Reverend McLean met them at the door, his beard gone pale with age and his coat patched at the elbows. He offered Victor a handshake and Cora a kind nod, then gestured to the front pew. There were no other congregants, just the 3 of them and the scent of pine garlands strung across the windows. "You were always a man of few words," the Reverend said as he took his place behind the lectern. "But you wrote to me clear enough." Victor nodded. "We'd like to be wed today." Cora met the Reverend's eyes. "I've no family to speak for me, but I speak for myself." "Sometimes that's the clearest voice a person can offer," the old man said gently. "You have a witness." Victor turned toward the door, where a teenage girl stood with a broom in her hand and snow in her dark braids. "Annie," he said. She blinked, then nodded and stepped forward with a shy smile. "I'll stand for you." The ceremony was simple. Vows spoken without hesitation, hands clasped firm, no rings exchanged, only promises. When it was done, the Reverend signed the certificate and pressed it into Victor's hand. "You take care of each other," he said, "and keep to the truth, even when it's hard." Victor met Cora's eyes. "That's the only way I know." They rode home slowly, the sun turning the snowfields gold as it lowered behind the hills. Halfway back, Cora laid her head against his shoulder without a word, and he shifted the reins to one hand so he could draw her closer. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky was the color of cooled metal. Victor stabled the horses while Cora lit the lamps, their glow soft against the snow still clinging to the windows. She set 2 bowls on the table, filled them with the stew she'd started that morning, and poured warm cider into the mugs beside them. When he came in, she was standing by the stove, untying the ribbon at her collar. He crossed the room in 3 steps and took her hands in his. "Is this real, Cora?" he asked, voice low. She looked up at him, her expression quiet and unwavering. "You are." That night they lay beneath a quilt stitched with faded stars, the wind brushing against the shutters and the dog curled beneath the bed. Neither of them spoke for a long while. She rested her head against his chest, and he held her like she was the first morning of spring. Snow fell through the night, blanketing the valley in silence. Come spring, the schoolhouse opened again. The roof was patched, the stove repaired, and benches scrubbed clean. Cora stood at the front with a slate in her hand and 10 children watching, some with suspicion, some with hope. She taught them letters and numbers, yes, but also how to listen, how to speak with care, how to tell the truth even when it cost them. Victor built a new barn that summer, with wide beams and a loft tall enough for hay to last through winter. He came in each afternoon with dust in his beard and sun on his neck, and Cora would meet him at the door with flour on her hands, or a story about one of the children who'd learned something new. They didn't say, "I love you" in the ways people wrote in books. They said it in how they worked, how they waited, how they didn't turn away from one another when the day was long and the night was quiet. By the end of the second year, the valley held more families. A baby was born in the house down by the draw. A new trail was cut through the pines. And one morning, Cora stood at the edge of the pasture, a hand resting on the curve of her belly, watching the wind ripple through the grass. Victor joined her without speaking. He wrapped an arm around her waist, and she leaned into him, the weight of the moment settling deep and sure between them. "We've built something," she said softly. "We have, and it's going to last." He didn't answer, but his hand moved to rest over hers, just above where the child stirred beneath her skin. It was a hard land. It would always be, but it was theirs, and it was good. And that was enough for the rest of their lives.